Hello and welcome to Wingin It. So we're back once again with another episode of the European Expansion Bootcamp as we get ready for the release of the European Expansion, which is coming to the digital version of Wingspan very soon. So joining me once again for this bootcamp series, I've got Tay from Tuck and Cash. So how are you doing, Tay?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me again.
No worries. Thanks for joining me again on this series. And yeah, this is part 6. We are going to be taking a look now at the new brown power birds that can go in the wetlands. So lots of interesting
Mm-hmm.
options here, I think, for drawing more cards, tucking lots of cards, getting some more points. So yeah, without further ado, let's take a look at the first set of cards here. So
All right.
these 4 birds are all to do with drawing lots more cards from your wetlands. So we've got 2 different types that you either reset the tray and be able to draw one of the new face-up cards, or you get to draw extra cards for each empty slot in your wetlands. So what are your views on these kinds of birds?
Well, I'm quite happy to see this new brown power that allows you to draw more cards and dig through more cards because that's always like part of the struggle when I play the base game. If you start a game with a really weak wetland and um, or you don't have a lot of brown power that allows you to dig through card, it really put you in a disadvantaged position. So I guess first of all, I'm quite happy to see that there's new options to dig through card. But I must say one thing that jumped out to me as well is this bird. They are not easy to play. They consume like 2 fish and 3 food. So I guess there's some trade off there.
Yeah, I think you make good points. I mean, we've talked about this time and time again about the importance of building up a strong wetlands and just giving yourself the ability to see lots of cards. I think particularly with the expansion, there's a lot of new cards that are being introduced, and that just makes the deck even bigger. So if you're trying to dig through the deck and find particular kinds of birds, you're going to need to see even more cards to
Yeah.
find those. So yeah, I think these are certainly very welcome additions. And yeah, on the food cost, I think it can be quite challenging. And I think that,
Hmm.
for me, I quite like the white-throated dipper here, just because
Yeah.
purely of that food cost. You can get it down on that first turn without having to gain extra food. And suddenly, you're able to see lots of cards, draw lots of cards from your wetlands, and that just gets you off to such a nice start.
Yeah. I agree as well. Um, I guess, looking at these 2 birds here on the left, they have star nests, which can be quite helpful for end of round goals and bonus card. I mean, I'm curious to, obviously these 2 have different powers. Like,
Mm.
which one do you think is stronger?
Yeah, I think the 2 on the left will be stronger earlier in the game because you're obviously going to have more empty spaces in your wetlands, so that's just going to let you see more cards. I mean, we have similar powers in the base game. They let you draw 2 and keep 1, but in this
Hmm.
case, you're potentially drawing 3 or even 4 and then keeping the best
Yeah.
one. So it just
Yeah.
lets you see more cards and keep the best one. So yeah, I think you make a good point as well. The star nest's always nice, but
Hmm.
I think all of these birds are really good, and certainly I'd be happy to have any of them in my starting hand.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, looking at the Greep and the Petrol, I like, how having, less bird in the wetland actually
Mm,
make it stronger. So that's something interesting to think about.
yeah, absolutely.
I guess one more question that I have, say if you start with the Greep or the Petrol, like do you think like just that like one bird alone is good enough for your wetland?
I think potentially it's good enough, at least for a few turns, and potentially for that first round. I think the petrol, the one thing that concerns me is that single egg space. So, if you are going to
Hmm.
play it and then try and lay eggs to draw extra cards, you're going to need to get another bird down first. And again, with that food cost, that's going to be quite difficult to do. But certainly, I think, because you are going to be seeing an additional 4 cards and keeping the best one, I think you can make do with just one of these in your wetlands for a little bit. But even once you do get that second wetland bird, it's still a reasonably strong power for me.
Yeah, good point.
All right. Well, that's the first set of birds to look at. So plenty more to get through. I
Yeah.
think now we can take a look at let's take a look at the little bitten and the squacko, if I
All
pronounced that
right.
right.
Yes.
I probably haven't, but yeah. So these two birds, again, they're going to let you draw extra cards, but specifically based on the habitat they can live in.
Hmm.
So, yeah, what are your views on these birds?
Well, first of all, I mean, I like the fact that they're easy to play because they
Mm,
cause a fish and a grub. You can play right from your hand. But obviously, 2 and 3 bird points are very low for a wetland bird in terms of value. Um, I mean, I'm not super excited about the brown power. I think it's a little bit limiting that you have to pick up birds that live in those specific habitat, and it can be troublesome if the tray doesn't have those birds. And I would just think like if there are birds that they're good and they live in those habitat, you would have just picked them up using your regular action with the wetland. You don't really need this brown power. So that would be my concern with this brown
yeah,
power, I guess.
I think it's a valid concern. I think,
Hmm.
like you say, you're either not picking up a bird in the tray so that you can use this power to pick it up, or you're going to be forced into picking up a bird that you didn't want to pick up anyway. So,
Yes.
is that much of an advantage? Especially
Hmm.
considering that by drawing a face-up card from the tray, you might then reveal something nice for the player going
Yes.
after you. And I know that's always a big concern of yours in Wingspan, so certainly
Everyone
applies
should be
here
concerned about that.
if you say so. But yeah, I just think these are pretty uninspiring powers, and
Yeah.
you can compare them to some of the birds we just looked at, or even some of the birds in the
Hmm.
base game that have very similar food cost and
Right.
potentially stronger powers. So yeah, I think if you could either get more bird points or maybe spend a little bit less food for these bird powers, then I might be more easily convinced. But yeah, I just think there are much better options out there already.
Yeah. I mean, they're not great, but I must say, they are not the worst to kickstart your
Mm,
wetland. At least it's still a brown power. I think
right.
this is still a better start than say like a bird with no power at all. So.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's still a way of getting extra cards, and I think
Hmm.
certainly if you can, pair these with, cards that let you tuck cards,
Hmm.
either in the wetlands or in other habitats, then sometimes it doesn't matter what cards you're drawing. You just need something,
Right.
and then you can use that to tuck later and hopefully get something better.
Yeah. Good point.
All right, well, we can move on from these two. And yeah, let's take a look at some birds that can help gain food in the wetlands, which
All
is
right.
always a little bit tricky. So, yeah, a couple of interesting powers here that actually let you steal food from other players. So,
Oh
yeah,
yeah.
that's always an interesting mechanic. So, how do you see these two birds playing out?
Yeah, I mean we do have quite a few birds in the European expansion that allows you to steal food from your opponent's supply. I guess like I noticed that these two powers are quite different.
Mm,
So for example, the kingfisher, you steal a fish and you have to catch it. But for the black-headed gull, you can actually use the food that you steal from your opponent. So, I mean, if I have to pick, I think the black-headed goat definitely has a huge advantage here, in the sense that you can actually use the food that you got from your opponent.
yeah, absolutely. I think just the flexibility as well in being able to steal whatever you want. Obviously,
Hmm.
the more opponents you have, potentially the more choice you have in terms of food.
Right.
And yeah, I think this could potentially be a really strong bird early game. You play this in your wetlands, you draw some cards.
Hmm.
Chances are your opponents are going to have some food, either that they've kept from their starting hand or that they've gained from their forest. So yeah, chances are if you can get some birds and some food on the same turn, that can just save you a little bit of tempo, which is always so important early on in the game.
I guess like another thing I want to point out is like I don't know, I just really dislike the food to point ratio for the kingfisher.
Mm.
For a power that I don't see will get used like a lot throughout the game, 3 food for 4 points is really kind of expensive.
Yeah, I think for me, what you're paying for with the Kingfisher is all in that nest space. So 5 egg
Right.
spaces in a star nest that can really
Mm-hmm.
make a difference in end of round goals. So I think that's probably where I would see myself playing this. But absolutely, you're right. 2 fish and a word for 4 points and a slightly mediocre power is certainly
Mm-hmm.
nothing that really gets me that excited.
Yeah.
Okay, well, those are certainly 2 interesting bird powers and lots more as well to take a look at. So let's take a look at some new tucking powers that we have in the wetlands that really have potential to score a lot of points. So yeah, some very interesting powers here and ones that I'm certainly excited to play with. But I'll let you say your piece on these first before I go on too long.
Well, again, I think overall, I'm again very excited to see this new brown power from this expansion. I think they are definitely gonna add a lot more horsepower to the wetland engine. Because each of this brown power allows you to tuck multiple cards per activation. Um, the bird that really jumps out to me obviously is going to be the common shift shaft, just because of the 1 food cost for 3 bird points, and you can potentially tug up to 5 cards and gain 5 points in one activation. That's just so strong.
Yeah, I think that Chiff Chaff, that's going to be the centerpiece of
Hmm.
wetland tucking engines, I think, in the European expansion. And
Yeah.
certainly, if you look at some of those other birds we saw before that let you gain extra cards, and obviously all of these existing birds we've got in the base game as well that let you gain extra cards, I think it's not going to be too difficult to be able to, potentially get 4 or 5 tucks, and that is just huge. Potentially comparing, as well with some of those other tucking birds. But yeah,
Hmm.
what obviously I think the Chiff Chaff is going to be the strongest of the three here. But what are your views on the Swan and the Flamingo?
Um, I think the my problem with the swan and the flamingo is that it costs 3 foods. So I just feel like they're gonna be a little bit hard to play and to kickstart a wetland in early game. And for flamingo as well, especially, I think the brown power is quite specific.
Mm.
You have to rely on your opponent activating their wetland a lot. So it's a situation where say your opponent is running a wetland engine, then that's where the flamingo is gonna really shine. But other than that, I don't think flamingo is that useful in general. You just won't generate that many tugs, and the 3 food for 3 bird points is a pretty low value to start with.
Yeah, I think only 1 egg space as well is really difficult to
Yeah,
work with.
that
So
too.
yeah, not a great return. And like you say, it's going to be so situational. I think this bird is
Hmm.
is either going to be terrible or it's potentially going to be
Hmm.
game winning if you
Yeah,
if you can use it against the right kind of engine. But I think the
yeah.
Mute Swan has good potential. I quite like the power. I think being able to tuck multiple birds, but then also draw as well. Replacement card. I think certainly that fits more into a well-rounded wetlands that is going to help gain you cards.
Hmm.
Obviously, the Chiff Chaff is going to be more focused on just tucking everything you draw, so you're not necessarily going to be generating resources. But yeah, I think being able to get points in your wetlands is always nice, and it comes back again to some of these other bird powers we've looked at before in this series that encourage you to take all of the actions in a particular round, and certainly try and score points that way and get some extra cards. So um, I'm certainly happy to see these new tucking powers in the expansion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know there's a huge you know, fan club behind the Mute Swan. And I guess, I don't have a lot of experience playing with the Mute Swan. So one of the questions that I have is, with the Mute Swan, like you say, obviously if you have a wetland engine that you're gonna run, it's gonna be very strong. But say in situation where you're not really running a wetland engine, do you think the Mute Swan is still worth it? Just for a regular wetland for card draw.
I think it can still be worth it. I
Okay.
think it doesn't need to be activated every turn to still be worthwhile. I think if
All
you
right.
if you have a pretty standard wetlands that's going to help you get cards is probably three birds in the wetlands. And so, particularly I think later in the game, it can be quite difficult to justify drawing cards when you're not scoring points. But I think
Yes.
if you can have the mute swan, potentially another tucking bird, or something that lets you draw extra cards in that wetlands, then drawing cards late in the game, you're still going to score points by tucking some of those birds that you're maybe not looking to play. So yeah, I think this fits well into a well-rounded strategy and doesn't necessarily have to only be used when you're going for a pure wetlands engine.
Yeah, very good point.
All right, well, some very nice tucking powers that we've looked at there. And we have got just four birds left in this wetlands group, and they're all a little bit different, but we will take a look at them all together as a group. So, yeah, we'll just go through them one by one. We've got the Eleanor's falcon, first of all. So, this lets you roll all the dice, not in the bird feeder. And if you get any rodents, you place an egg on this card. So, quite similar to some of the hunting powers that we've already seen
Right.
in the base game. But yeah, how do you compare this to that kind of power that we're already very used to?
Yeah, this is an interesting power. I think potentially, being able to gain one egg when you activate wetland could be a huge boost to your tempo in early game. But the thing I worry about is we all know how unreliable rolling hunting power is. So
Mm.
the fact that you can reliably generating that egg is kind of off-putting for me. It's gonna weaken this card a lot, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. We have a lot of experience at the base game of these kind of dice rolling hunting powers, and yeah, they're not really the kind of power that you can rely on to score points. So if
Hmm.
this is going to be your only egg source in the wetlands, and you're really counting on this to get an egg to be able to activate a power or play a bird, I think this is just going to mostly be disappointing, unfortunately.
Yeah, especially in early game when no one has picked any food from the bird feeder,
Mm, yeah,
then you have no dice to roll. Yeah, that's just not great.
yeah, that's always tricky.
Yep.
All right, moving on, we next have the common moorhen. So this is quite similar to a couple of birds in the forest that we looked at
Mm.
in an earlier episode, where you get to discard food and play extra birds in your wetlands. So yeah, how do you see this kind of fitting into a wetlands, and how do you compare this to the two forest birds we've already looked at?
Yeah, this one is an interesting one. Again, I just think this is gonna be very situational.
Mm,
First of all, to play the Moorhen, it required 3 foods, so that's a lot of food that you need to invest in it. And then to activate the power, you need to discard more food from your supply, and then you have to pay for the bird that you're gonna play. So, I think unless you have a really strong forest to support this, or you have like a raven, um, otherwise, I just don't see how you can effectively use this brown power.
yeah, I think that's really the main drawbacks. Having that extra food can often be really difficult. And
Mhm.
we talked before about the kind of order in which you look to set up your habitats. You tend to want to build up the wetlands first and then the forest. So I think
Right.
this kind of works the other way around, where if you set up that forest first and are able to generate lots of food, then you could potentially
Mhm.
use the moorhen to play extra birds. But yeah, I think the food cost and the point return is quite off-putting. Obviously, like the kingfisher that we just looked at, does have lots of egg spaces in a star nest, so that could potentially help
Yes.
out as well. But yeah, it,
Mhm.
it feels like a very situational power that requires very careful use to really make the most of it.
Yeah, I'm really trying to think about this power. I mean, I think in wetland it's always stronger to have brown power that allows you to cycle card.
Yeah.
So, looking at this power, do you think this could be a good bird or good brown power? Say you have a strong food generation, and this can be used to play big points bird in the wetland. Is that one way you can use this?
I think potentially, but what you're going to be relying on is actually being able to draw the right birds. So
Right.
if you have this in your wetlands, maybe it's the first bird that you've played. You're going to be gambling on the deck, and if you might not even draw anything that can go in the wetlands, let alone something you might
Yeah.
want to play, and that's always difficult. So yeah, I think it's going to be something where if you already have the birds in your hand to play those, then absolutely,
Hmm.
I can see this working out. But yeah, it's a very tricky timing point. Do you play this early in the game or do you play it late in the game? I still can't really work out the right timing for this kind of bird.
Yeah, we shall see.
We shall see. All right, we can move on to the penultimate bird of the video. So we've got the Orderwin's Gull. Now, I like this bird a lot, so I won't say too much. I will let you share your views on it first, but I think this is a very interesting looking power.
Yeah. I mean, okay, so you draw two, but you tuck one and then keep the other one. So, this remind me of, say, the yellow throat that allows you
Mm,
to draw two and then keep one and discard the other. So I think in this case, you get to tuck the card instead of discarding it. So you are generating points when you activate this. So I guess the trade-off here is that it does cost one more food compared to the yellow throat. So I guess the question is that extra food worth it for the points that you can potentially generate? Um, I think I think in general it is still a very good power. Especially it's going to be very strong in a wetland engine. Um, but yeah, I think it is strong.
yeah, and I think this is quite similar to the mute swan that we looked at before, in that it's
Right.
obviously going to work very nicely in a kind of pure wetlands engine where you're going to try and score a lot of points, get a lot of target cards. But I think you're right as well in that you compare it to something like the yellowthroat or the ruddy duck, that kind of style of bird that we're used to in the base game. This is essentially an upgrade on that. And I
Hmm.
think, for one extra food, obviously a fish can be quite difficult to get hold of, but the wild
Right.
food, very, very flexible. So yeah, I certainly think this is an upgrade on that style of bird that we're used to from the base game.
Yeah. And now that I think about it, one thing I like about this power compared to the yellow throat or ruddy duck is, those two birds, because they only have one bird point. Sometime in mid game, even when you need more cards,
Mm.
it's kind of awkward to play them because there's only one bird point. But with the goal here, you can potentially still play in mid game, knowing that you can potentially generate points when you activate your wetland still. So
Yeah, absolutely. And again, similar to the Swan, if you have something like this, you feel a little bit safer drawing cards
right.
later in the game because you are still scoring points. So it's not a completely dead action. But yeah, I certainly think there's a lot of potential with this card. Okay, moving on to the final bird. So talking of birds that are similar to the yellow throat, we've got the Savvy's Warbler.
Yes.
So you get to draw two cards, and everyone else
Hmm.
draws one. So potentially being able to see a lot of cards early in the game with this kind of bird.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think, any brown power that allows you to draw more cards in the wetlands is a great way to kickstart your wetlands. So I quite like this. I quite like this brown power.
Yeah, how do you compare this to something like the spotted sandpiper or the Wilson
Hmm.
snipe from the base game? Obviously, those let everyone draw a single card, whereas this is going to let you draw two. How do you make that kind of comparison between those two types of birds?
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting. I mean, if you compare to the just the bird points, so the sandpiper give you 5 bird points.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of bird points, 5 bird points just give you a bigger window
Mm.
for you when you can play the sandpiper, for example. With the Savi Wobblers, we kind of talk about this 1 bird points, like, when you're in the mid game, even when you need cards, it can be kind of awkward to play. But in terms of the brown power, again, you're giving cards to your opponent, but in case of sandpiper, everyone get one card. So if your opponent get a better card than you, then it kind of benefit your opponent more. But I guess with this brown power, you're guaranteed that you're getting two cards, but your opponent only get one. So you can kind of make the argument that whenever you activate this, you're always going to get bigger benefits than your opponent.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. This certainly feels like a really strong bird to play in that first round. I think particularly if you have this in your opening hand, it kind of feels like a
Mm,
must play in terms of just being able to get access to the extra cards.
yeah.
But certainly that window of opportunity for when you can play it is certainly smaller than something like the Sandpiper, just purely because you are only getting 1 point, which is always difficult to make a case for playing.
Yeah, I think being able to gain 2 cards per activation is gonna help to feed, other tugging birds, say, in the grassland or in the forest, so there's potential to synergize with other birds as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly some good synergies on display. All right. Well, that's all of the wetland birds that we're going to take a look at today. And that concludes the brown powers section of this bootcamp series. So, yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed and found these videos useful. And definitely stay tuned. We will be taking a look at some other aspects of the European expansion. So, those will be coming very soon. And yeah, thanks again for joining me, Terry. Hopefully, you've enjoyed taking a look at all of these brown powers.
Yeah, absolutely, anytime.